Welcome to my channel. Subscribe, listen and enjoy my stories every day. I always thought Diane and I had a solid marriage. Maybe we weren't perfect, but we were close. She was the kind of woman who turned heads and made people feel like they were the most important person in the room. Smart, charming, and driven, she had a spark that made people gravitate toward her. And I loved her for it. We'd been together 15 years, built a life and a home, raised our son, and shared dreams about growing old together. Or so I thought. Life has a way of humbling you when you least expect it. One Saturday evening, Diane told me she had a dinner with a colleague to discuss some pressing work matters. This wasn't the first time she'd mentioned this name, a guy named Jeremy. Just another coworker, she said, someone she occasionally needed to work late with. I didn't think much of it at first. I remember saying, "Have fun," in the most casual way, like I hadn't noticed the way she lingered on the details. But as I watched her get ready, that feeling gnawed at me again. That nagging feeling, the one I'd been ignoring for months, clawed its way into my thoughts that night. She'd been acting different lately, finding reasons to work late or disappearing on weekends. She'd come back with flimsy explanations, but I didn't press. I didn't want to be the jealous husband, the one suspicious of every text and every late night. Besides, I'd always trusted Diane. That night, she returned past midnight, her makeup slightly smeared, lipstick faded, but with a smile lingering just a little too long. When she sat down next to me, there was a charged silence in the room. I could smell her perfume mixed with something else. My mind didn't want to process it, didn't want to leap to conclusions, but all my instincts were screaming. She tried to cover it up with small talk, telling me about her meeting, recounting pointless details with a jittery eagerness I'd never seen in her before. I felt like her words were coming from someone else. I watched her, nodding, and let the gnawing feeling simmer. She thought I was buying it, but in truth, I had already made up my mind. I wouldn't say anything that night. I was going to wait. And when the truth came out, I'd make her face it head-on. Over the next few weeks, I became a man on a mission. Every time Diane left for her so-called work dinners or weekend seminars, I noted the times, the locations, her demeanor. I went through her things, scanned her emails, checked her texts. She always kept her phone locked, but she'd been careless once or twice and I'd noticed her password. A few letters, a couple of numbers, something related to her college days. I felt wrong invading her privacy, but the need for answers overpowered any guilt. And then, one night, I found it. A text message thread between Diane and Jeremy. She hadn't even tried to hide it, hadn't deleted the messages. In my head, I could rationalize that they were just colleagues, maybe friends. But then I read the texts. They were vile, graphic, filled with a kind of familiarity and intimacy that only a fool could ignore. Words that had once been reserved for me, descriptions of secret meetings, their plans for the next time. There were dozens of messages. Each one was like a knife twisting deeper and deeper, carving out the image of the woman I thought I knew and replacing it with a stranger. That was the moment something inside me broke. All the trust, all the memories we'd built together felt like they had been reduced to ashes. She had destroyed us. I knew then that I wasn't going to confront her right away. No, I wanted her to feel every ounce of betrayal I felt. This wouldn't just be a "let's talk" moment. She was going to know exactly what her actions had done, and I'd make her pay for it. The following days, I quietly prepared. I took stock of our bank accounts, moved money into a private account that only I could access, and reached out to a lawyer discreetly. Diane was busy, or so she claimed, leaving early and coming home late, so she didn't notice my sudden change in behavior. She probably thought I was blind to her late nights and work dinners. But every time she walked through the door, I'd see the smugness in her eyes, that slight satisfaction that said she thought she'd gotten away with it. The strangest part of it all was that she seemed happier, more alive. As if cheating on me had given her a newfound thrill. I'd sit there watching her laugh, pretending everything was fine, but the hurt simmered. Nights turned into days, days turned into weeks, and still, I held back, waiting for the right moment. One evening, she told me she had a conference in Orlando. It was supposed to be a 3-day event. She didn't even try to hide her excitement. She told me she'd call every night and check in with me and our son, but I already knew she'd be too busy with Jeremy. I nodded, pretended to be supportive, and helped her pack. As I watched her pack her bags, a mix of rage and relief washed over me. This was it. I was finally done playing the clueless, trusting husband. She'd be gone for a few days, and I'd use that time to put my plans into motion. I didn't plan on her coming back to the same life she thought she'd left behind. The night she left, I waited until our son was asleep and pulled out her laptop. It took a while, but eventually, I found more evidence. Hotel receipts, dinner reservations, messages saved in folders labeled work notes. Each one was a confirmation, a reminder that the woman I loved had lied to my face, day after day, for God knows how long. As I closed her laptop, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad either. I was just resolved. I could see the end of this road, and for the first time, it felt like freedom. When she got back, she was in for a surprise. The day Diane left for Orlando, the wheels were already in motion. Her conference was the perfect cover. She was too focused on her getaway with Jeremy to notice how calm I'd been, how I hadn't protested or asked more questions. I just sat back and watched her pack, her excitement practically bubbling over. If she only knew what was waiting for her when she got back. After she left, I waited an hour to be sure she was well on her way before starting. Our son, thankfully, was at a friend's house for the night, so I had the place to myself. I poured myself a drink, sat at the dining table, and made a list of everything I needed to do over the next few days. I wasn't about to do anything reckless, every step would be calculated. The first task was calling my lawyer. I had a friend, Mike, who had gone through a brutal divorce a few years back, and I remembered how he'd said, "The right lawyer makes all the difference." So, I called the same lawyer he'd used, a no-nonsense type who specialized in cases like mine. I explained everything. I left out the emotions and kept it strictly to the facts. My wife had been unfaithful, there was plenty of evidence, and I was ready to file for divorce. My lawyer, Richard, listened without interruption. I half expected him to jump in with questions, but he was silent until I finished. "Well," he said after a pause, "you've got plenty of grounds for a favorable outcome, especially if you have evidence. But if you're looking to keep assets in custody, we'll need to play this smart. Get everything documented and stay composed. I'll prepare the papers, and we can file once she's back. In the meantime, do you have access to any joint accounts?" I assured him that I did. I'd already moved some of our savings into a separate account. He recommended I stay discreet and make no drastic changes until we'd filed. It was advice I intended to follow, but it was hard to suppress the urge to clear everything out. I knew if I acted too soon, it would give her time to fight back. So I'd wait, and let her walk into this on my terms. Next, I turned my attention to gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I went through her phone records, her laptop, emails, even bank statements. It was disturbing, really, how brazen she'd been. She hadn't even bothered to hide the hotel reservations under a pseudonym or delete texts. It was as if she believed she'd never get caught, that she had this all under control. The arrogance stung as much as the betrayal. As I dug through her digital life, I found an email from Jeremy. He was writing to her from his personal account, some cheap attempt at romance. "Counting down the days until I see you again, babe." It made my stomach turn. Here she was, leaving me for a guy who could barely string together a coherent sentence. I clicked through more emails, finding photos of them at restaurants, on the beach, even one where they were laughing, arms around each other, in front of a hotel in Miami. Every picture was a knife twist, but it also fueled me. I saved everything and backed it up in a hidden file on my own computer. The day after she left, I focused on preparing the house. I didn't want her walking in on me packing her things. I wanted her to come back to a house that felt normal, right until the moment I pulled the rug out from under her. So, I tidied up, made sure our son's room was neat, and set aside a few items I'd need for the day she returned. She was going to see the full extent of her betrayal laid out before her, and I was going to enjoy watching her squirm. I'll admit, it wasn't easy to keep my emotions in check, especially when she called that night. I'd thought about ignoring her call, but that would have been out of character. I didn't want her to suspect anything, so I answered, making sure to keep my voice light and casual. "Hey, babe," she said, sounding cheerful, like she was on top of the world. "Just calling to check in. How's everything going?" "Fine," I replied, keeping my tone as even as I could. "Our son's at his friend's house, so it's been quiet around here." "Oh, that's nice," she said, a hint of relief in her voice. She probably felt safe, certain that she was getting away with it. "I'll be back on Monday, so don't miss me too much, okay?" I forced a chuckle. "We'll survive. Enjoy your time. See you soon." Hanging up, I felt a rush of anger I hadn't felt before. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the way she spoke to me, casually, as if everything was fine. She had no idea what was coming. The weekend crawled by. I spent it arranging everything I'd need, checking and rechecking all the documents, and making sure the house was ready for her return. Richard had arranged for the divorce papers to be delivered on Monday evening, just as she'd be settling back in. I wanted her to have a few hours of normalcy before her world crumbled. Every little detail was planned, right down to the message I'd prepared for her. Monday finally arrived, and I could feel the tension building as the hours passed. Diane called in the afternoon to let me know she'd be home by dinner time. I kept my responses short, biting down the anger that threatened to spill over. I knew this was the last time I'd ever pretend with her. When she walked through the door that evening, I was ready. She looked radiant, as if she'd just come back from a spa. There was a glow about her, a lightness that made me sick. I watched her greet our son, laughing and chatting like she was the happiest woman in the world. Part of me wanted to scream at her right then and there, but I held back. After our son went to bed, she poured herself a glass of wine and joined me in the living room. She looked at me with that same smug smile, clearly proud of whatever fantasy life she thought she was living. But I had other plans. "So, how was your trip?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She took a sip of wine and sighed. "Oh, it was fine. The conference was long, but it was productive." She gave me a smile, that same fake smile she'd perfected over the years. "Productive, huh?" I leaned back, watching her reaction carefully. "Funny thing, I was looking at some photos online and came across a picture of you. In Miami. With Jeremy." The color drained from her face. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. The glass of wine shook in her hand. "What, no clever excuse?" I continued, feeling the anger rising. "No well-rehearsed story about how it's all a big misunderstanding?" Her mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water, but she couldn't come up with anything. The shock and guilt were plain on her face, and it was almost satisfying to watch her squirm. "You think you can just go on these little vacations, lie to me, disrespect me, and that I'll just, what? Sit back and take it?" I can explain," she stammered, finally finding her voice, but it was weak, shaky. The confidence she'd carried in with her was gone. "Explain? Really? Because I've got all the evidence right here." I held up a folder filled with printed emails, photos, and receipts. Her eyes widened as she stared at it, understanding the full weight of her actions. "I've already filed for divorce," I said, my voice cold. And you'll be served papers soon. So don't bother explaining. Save it for the judge. Her face fell, and I could see the panic setting in. Wait, she whispered, her voice desperate. Please, let's talk about this. I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you, I swear. I cut her off. You already made your choice. Now you'll live with it. With that, I stood up, leaving her to sit in stunned silence. As I walked out of the room, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The pain of betrayal was still there, but now, it was mixed with a sense of relief. The life I thought I'd lost was finally mine again, and for the first time in years, I was free. After that night, Diane was a ghost of her former self. The reality had hit her hard, and I could see it in every word she tried to speak, every glance she gave me that pleaded for forgiveness. But I didn't care anymore. She had destroyed any bridge we once had, and I wasn't interested in fixing it. I had spent too many nights grappling with the lies, the betrayal, the sheer arrogance of it all. Now, it was her turn to face the consequences. The divorce papers arrived at her office the next day. She called me from work, her voice trembling, almost begging, but I'd heard enough of her lies. I told her everything was clear in the documents, and we had nothing left to discuss. I could feel her desperation through the phone, her stumbling words that wanted to convince me that she could change. But I was done listening. A week went by, and Diane moved into the guest bedroom. She was too ashamed to leave, and I wasn't going to do her the courtesy of leaving myself. Why should I? I'd built this life, provided for our family, and she had the audacity to sneak around and ruin it. Now she could live with the hollow shell she'd created. I was happy to see her suffer in silence, knowing every night in that lonely room was a reminder of the choice she'd made. Diane tried to reach out more frequently. She started doing small things around the house, extra chores, cooking dinner, helping our son with his schoolwork. She would try to initiate conversations with me, offering a quiet apology, saying she wanted to explain herself. But every attempt felt hollow. I saw through her gestures. They were just a cover for her own guilt, a desperate effort to convince herself that she was trying. I didn't need her pity, and I didn't want her apologies. One evening, a couple of weeks after the papers were served, Diane approached me in the kitchen while I was preparing dinner for myself. Our son was staying with a friend that night, so the house was empty and quiet. Diane hovered by the door, looking hesitant. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't even turn around. "There's nothing to talk about, Diane. Please, just hear me out." Her voice cracked slightly, a sign of the guilt eating away at her. "I know what I did was wrong. I know I betrayed you, and I can't take that back. But, can you just let me explain?" I turned to face her, crossing my arms. "Explain? Explain what, Diane? That you thought you could sneak around, lie to my face, and expect me to be okay with it?" Her eyes filled with tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to understand. I was feeling lost. I thought you didn't care anymore. You were so busy with work, and I felt invisible." "That's your excuse," I said, my voice low and cold. "You felt invisible, so you ran off with some guy from work and threw everything away." "No, it wasn't like that," she said, shaking her head, the tears now streaming down her face. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." "Things don't just happen, Diane," I replied sharply. "You made a choice. Over and over again, you made that choice, and you knew exactly what you were doing." She was silent, her face contorted with shame and regret. I could tell she wanted to keep talking, but the weight of my words seemed to paralyze her. "I tried so hard to be the best husband I could," I continued. "I gave you everything I had, and you repaid me by making a mockery of our marriage. And now you want me to understand. You want me to feel sorry for you." She looked down, unable to meet my gaze. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, she said softly. But please, for our son, let's try to work this out. He needs both of us. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. Our son was the only reason I'd even considered staying civil through this ordeal. He didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this mess. But her attempt to use him as a reason to rebuild something irreparably broken only made me angrier. We'll work out custody, I said, my voice flat. But don't think that changes anything between us. She nodded slowly, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I understand, she whispered. I wish I could take it all back. I left her standing there, her face a mess of tears and regret. Her words didn't mean anything to me anymore. They were just hollow echoes of a past she'd already destroyed. I couldn't find it in myself to care about her remorse. She'd made her choices, and now she had to live with them. As the weeks passed, Diane's attempts at reconciliation became more desperate. She would leave notes around the house, small messages asking me to remember the good times, to consider a future where we might be able to rebuild. I ignored every one. Each note was just another reminder of her betrayal, another stab at the life we'd lost. Eventually, she stopped leaving notes, and her presence around the house became quieter, more subdued. It was as if she was gradually accepting that I was done with her, that our marriage was nothing more than a shell. She even stopped trying to convince me to talk about it, resigned to the fact that I was finished with her excuses. Then, one evening, I received a call from Jeremy's wife. Her voice was icy, laced with a bitterness that felt all too familiar. She'd finally pieced together what had been going on between Diane and Jeremy, and she wanted answers. She told me how she discovered hotel receipts, late-night texts, and all the telltale signs of betrayal. She asked me how long I'd known, how I was handling it. For the first time, I felt a pang of camaraderie. We were both victims of their lies, bound together by the betrayal of the people we'd once trusted. I told her what I knew, shared the details of Diane's affair, the evidence I'd collected, and the steps I'd taken to protect myself. We shared a silence on the phone, a quiet understanding that only those who've been betrayed can share. Thank you, she finally said, her voice softer. I don't know what I'm going to do, but, at least now I know the truth. Good luck, I said, feeling a strange sense of relief. Maybe it was knowing that I wasn't alone in this nightmare, or maybe it was the validation that came from hearing another person's pain. Either way, the conversation felt like a weight lifting from my shoulders. After that, I felt a strange peace settle over me. Diane's betrayal, once so raw and consuming, began to feel like a distant wound, something that would scar but no longer bleed. My focus shifted to our son, to creating a stable environment for him amidst the chaos. Diane continued to live in the guest bedroom, a shadow of her former self, and I let her stay, for now. Our son needed stability, and as much as I despised her, I wouldn't turn our home into a battlefield. One night, while tucking our son into bed, he asked, "Dad, why is Mom so sad all the time?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. He was too young to understand the full truth, and I didn't want to burden him with our problems. Sometimes adults go through hard times, buddy, I said, brushing his hair back. But don't worry. No matter what, I'll always be here for you. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my answer, and hugged me tightly. In that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice. Diane might have shattered our marriage, but I still had my son, and I'd do everything I could to protect him from the fallout. The days turned into weeks, and eventually, Diane and I came to an agreement about custody. She would move out, and we'd split time with our son as evenly as possible. I could see the sadness in her eyes when she packed her things, a quiet resignation that mirrored the finality of what we'd lost. As she closed the door behind her for the last time, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to hate her, to let my anger consume me. But another part of me felt free. She was gone, and with her went the lies, the betrayal, and the pain. I'd survived the worst of it, and now, I could finally start to rebuild. I watched her walk away from the house, her figure shrinking as she moved down the path. And with each step she took, I felt a little lighter, a little stronger. She'd made her choices, and now, it was my turn to make mine. As I closed the door behind me, I realized that this was the beginning of a new chapter. One without her lies, her deceit, or her regret. Just me and my son, moving forward, building a future on our own terms. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. Months passed after Diane moved out, and life finally started to feel steady. Our son was adjusting well, and I was doing my best to be both his father and his foundation. Each day was filled with moments that reminded me of what mattered, my boys' laughter, the small routines we shared, the dinners we'd cook together. There was a comfort in this new normal, one built on hard lessons and careful resilience. But in the quiet, there were still moments that reminded me of what I'd lost, not just the marriage, but the illusion of stability I'd once clung to. Then, one late afternoon in December, a phone call shattered the quiet equilibrium I had worked so hard to build. It was Diane. Her voice was strained, as if she was fighting to keep her composure, but the words she spoke were clear: our son was in an accident. I don't know if he's going to make it. Time froze. Every word became a distant echo as I struggled to comprehend the horror. I felt myself say something, maybe a curse or a plea, I couldn't tell. My heart thudded in my chest as I grabbed my keys and sped to the hospital, a storm of emotions overtaking me. At the hospital, Diane was already there, her face pale and streaked with tears. She was sitting alone, hands clasped, staring at the sterile white floor as if praying that looking up would break whatever spell had been cast over us. The sight of her only fueled my anguish, but I couldn't waste time on anger now. There was too much at stake. I rushed to the doctor, who explained the situation in clinical terms, each sentence landing like a punch. There had been a car accident. A drunk driver had swerved off the road, slamming into the side of Diane's car as she drove our son back from his friend's house. He had suffered severe head trauma, multiple fractures, and was in critical condition. They'd taken him into surgery immediately, but the odds were slim. The hours that followed were a blur of pacing, praying, and silent dread. I watched the minutes tick by on the sterile hospital clock, the world outside the waiting room feeling miles away. Diane and I sat together, bound by the shared agony of waiting for any word on our son's condition. Every so often, she'd reach for my hand, and while my instinct was to pull away, I found myself holding on, desperate for any kind of human connection in this hollow place of grief. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor emerged from the operating room. He looked tired, his face drawn, and his eyes met mine with a gravity that turned my stomach. "We did everything we could," he said softly, "but we couldn't save him. I'm so sorry." The word struck like a tidal wave, crashing over me, dragging me under. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Diane collapsed into sobs beside me, but I was frozen, numb to everything but the empty ache that seemed to consume every part of me. I don't remember much of what happened after that. There were quiet condolences, the hollow reassurances of hospital staff, and eventually, the cold walk to the car. Diane and I sat in silence on the drive home, the weight of our grief filling every inch of the vehicle. She was shaking, barely able to hold herself together, but I was numb, barely able to process the reality that I would never see my son again. In the days that followed, we drifted like ghosts through the arrangements, organizing the funeral, the memorial. Friends and family offered their condolences, but their words felt like static, empty sounds that only deepened the void. Diane tried to comfort me, but every time I saw her face, it reminded me of the choices she'd made, the damage she'd done. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to find solace in the presence of the only person who could understand this pain. But I couldn't. The night after the funeral, Diane came to the house. She stood on the porch, looking frail and lost, as if she were made of the same grief that had settled over both of us. I let her in, more out of exhaustion than anything else. We sat in the living room, the silence heavy between us. "Do you blame me?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. The anger I had felt for her betrayal was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but now it was tangled with a sadness so profound that it left me hollow. "Does it even matter?" I replied, my voice empty. She looked down, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I know I ruined everything," she said. "But he was the one good thing we had. And now he's gone." Her words cut through me, and I felt the bitterness rise, a resentment so strong it almost choked me. I had loved our son more than anything, and now that love had nowhere to go, nothing to hold on to. I wanted to scream, to yell at her, to make her feel the depth of the hurt she had caused. But instead, I sat in silence, the grief too overwhelming for words. The days bled into each other, each one an echo of the last. Diane started coming by more often, her presence both a comfort and a reminder of all that had been lost. I tried to push her away, but she clung to our shared grief, as if it was the last thing tethering her to this world. She apologized, again and again, but the words fell flat. She couldn't undo what had been done. One evening, after months of this fragile truce, Diane asked if I'd ever be able to forgive her. I looked at her, the woman I had once loved, the woman who had betrayed me, and now, the woman who had endured the same tragic loss. "I don't know," I said, my voice raw. "I don't know if I can forgive you, but I know we'll carry this together. Whether we want to or not." We sat in silence, both of us trapped in the same sorrow. We were two broken people, bound by the loss of our son and the ruins of a marriage that had already crumbled. There was no easy answer, no redemption, only the bitter truth that we would never escape the shadows of our choices and our grief. In the end, Diane moved away, and I stayed in the empty house, haunted by memories of laughter and the faint echoes of a life that was no longer mine. I tried to move forward, to find some semblance of peace, but every day felt like a reminder of the son I'd lost, the family I'd once had. And as the years passed, I realized that the pain would never fade. The wound was too deep, the loss too profound. Diane's betrayal had shattered our marriage, but it was the loss of our son that had broken me beyond repair. In the end, I was left with nothing but memories and an empty house. And as much as I tried to move on, a part of me remained frozen in that hospital waiting room, waiting for a miracle that would never come.